Open wounds cannot heal if we are divided. We must seek real bipartisan solutions.
As the United States mourns the victims of the most recent mass shootings, the president promises action. Will something change this time? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The number of deaths in the two mass shootings over the weekend has reached 31. Dozens more were wounded. The shootings happened just hours apart in an entertainment district in Dayton, Ohio, and at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, near the border with Mexico. Let's bring in our panel from California. John Donohue is a professor at Stanford University Law School. Also from California is Leonard Zeskind. He is the founder of the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights, and author of the book Blood and Politics, The History of the White Nationalist Movement from the Margins to the Mainstream. Here in our studio, Lester Munson is a principal at BGR Group, a leading government relations firm here in Washington, D.C. And Greg Shaffer is a former FBI agent and founder of the Shaffer Security Group. He joins us from Dallas. Welcome to all of you. Lester, let's start right here in the studio. Shortly after these shootings happened in El Paso and in Dayton, Ohio, it became a political issue. And we heard from a number of the Democrat candidates who are running for president. They want the presidential nomination. They had a whole range of views. Here's what some of them had to say. Let's watch.
When you have language that is racist, that is virulently anti-immigrant, there are mentally unstable people in this country who see that as a sign to do terrible, terrible things.
Donald Trump is responsible for this. He's responsible because he is stoking fears and hatred and bigotry.
He is encouraging this. Folks are responding to this. It doesn't just offend us. It encourages the kind of violence that we're seeing.
I read the manifesto. Parts of it, could have come out of a Trump rally.
There is a consequence to the words that the President of the United States speaks.
We cannot keep America safe from this threat to the American people if we're not prepared to name it and confront it.
So, Lester, is it fair to blame the president for what happened at the shootings? Should the president take some of the blame? He has made some incendiary comments about Mexicans, about immigrants.
Well, some of his comments over the last few years have really been terrible and are worthy of criticism and to be condemned. I think it's going too far to say he's responsible for the killings. It's the shooter who's responsible for the killings. And I think there's a real challenge for the Democrat presidential candidates right now, which is they need to find a kind of a new thing to say. They need to demonstrate some leadership here. It can't always be about President Trump. It is the one thing that's kind of uniting their party, but for them to kind of take that next step, they need to show some real leadership. I think they need to find a way to work with the other side. And so I think the first candidate to actually do that and take a little bit of a risk and be willing to work with Republicans is going to distinguish themselves from the rest of the crowd.
All right, let me bring in Leonard Zeskind. Leonard Zeskind, of course, the comments we're hearing come from both sides. The White House acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, he cited language that is being used by Democrats when conservatives have been the victims or the targets of violence. Let's watch and listen to what he said.
Was Bernie Sanders responsible for when my friends got shot playing baseball? I don't think that he was. Was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez responsible when someone drove up to a DHS facility with a homemade bomb and an AR-15 and tried to blow the place up, calling it a concentration camp, the same rhetoric that she used? Was she responsible? I don't think that she was. I blame the people who pulled the trigger, Chuck. Goodness gracious, is someone really blaming the president? These people are sick.
So, Leonard, what do you make of the fact that this has become such a big political issue so quickly? And can we really compare the two scenarios that we heard there?
Well, white nationalism is a problem in its own right. It's an ideological phenomenon. It's not a problem of mentally disturbed people. It's an actual movement with college professors, lawyers, doctors, and all types in it. And I think it's been mischaracterized probably by both sides. I don't see the Democrats with a long history of opposing white nationalism. And certainly Donald Trump is a megaphone for bigotry. And there is no doubt about that. Anybody that tries to characterize what this congresswoman said or that's just trying to get the heat off of the president. The fact is, he's a bigot. He spreads racism. And this shooter, many of the things he said have been said very clearly by analysis of his manifesto. The things he said in his manifesto and the things Trump have said have matched up.
Greg Shaffer, what do you make of what the president is being called there? Much is being made of the fact that the gunman, in this case, published a manifesto variously described as being a white supremacist manifesto, a racist manifesto, hateful, anti-immigrant, and that he used language in that manifesto often used by President Trump.
Well, first of all, if you read a manifesto, it clearly states that the shooter had no animus toward Trump and certainly said that Trump had nothing to do with his decision to go with this mass shooting. So let's get that off the table right now. This had nothing to do with Trump, had nothing to do with the Republican Party. There's one person responsible for the killing in El Paso, Texas, and that's the shooter. It certainly is not the president. It's certainly not the Republican Party. It's one person. It's the evil person that pulled the trigger. Plain and simple.
I take your point there, Greg, but what about what motivated this particular shooter? He seems to have been driven by some kind of ideological belief.
Oh, absolutely. He was definitely a white supremacist who wanted to kill Hispanics, and he drove 9 hours to do so. So there's no doubt in my mind that he was ideologically driven. But the ideology did not come from anybody other than his own self-belief and the fact that he was radicalized by himself.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff
was caused by a movement. He was radicalized by a movement. He was part of a movement. I think to separate him from the white nationalist movement is to make a mistake of the first order.
Go ahead, Greg.
Well, first of all, sir, your term white nationalist is a false term. I'm a white nationalist. I love my country. I've served my country for 31 years. I'm a white man.
I didn't accuse you of being a white nationalist.
No, I'm saying the term you're using is offensive.
Is a
white
term
supremacy, sir.
That they
white supremacy. No, the term white nationalist is a term that has been brought up by the media and those that oppose.
It's a term that the movement uses to describe itself.
Okay.
White supremacy.
All right, I want to move on to and bring in John Donohue into the conversation. John Donohue, President Trump has been talking about this. He spoke today at the White House. He believes that there are other things at play here, that the gunman could have been influenced by video games, by the internet, which is responsible, that he says, for much of the gun violence that we see today. Do you agree with that?
No, I think the evidence on video game playing actually cuts the other way. Japan and Korea probably lead the world in terms of number of adolescents playing video games, and they have virtually no gun homicide problem. It really is a combination of these diseased political movements coupled with mentally troubled individuals marinating in a gun culture with enormous access to very high-powered weaponry that drives the rather poor performance of the United States compared to our, other industrialized nations.
Lester, John Donohue mentioned mental health there, and President Trump has talked of the link between mental health and mass shootings on Monday morning. He said mental illness and hatred pulled the trigger, not the gun. The president also offered this solution. Let's watch this.
We must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms, and that if they do, those firearms can be taken through rapid due process. That is why I have called for red flag laws.
So there are some states in the United States which have red flag laws, but the president has recognized that mental health is one of the contributing factors to mass shootings. But he rolled back precautions, regulations that were put in place by his predecessor, Barack Obama.
Right. Well, we've seen this president have the ability to play, to advocate both sides of an issue on several occasions. So I guess it's not that's too surprising. He doesn't make a terrible point today, though. There's no question that mental health issues are a factor. I wouldn't totally dismiss the idea of violent video games playing a part of this, particularly in the American context. And perhaps sensible gun control measures should also be considered. I think what the American people are really looking for politically from their representatives, from the president and Congress, is a willingness to talk to the other side and to consider the other side's views and maybe come to a compromise or a comprehensive solution. And so I think it's a bad move for the Democrats to condemn what the president has said, and I think it's bad news for the president to immediately dismiss the policy solutions that the Democrats are suggesting.
Right, and talking about common sense solutions, Lester, there seems to be a big gap here between the US Congress, which will pass all these laws, and the American people. There's a Quinnipiac poll which says that's 60% of Americans support background checks, for instance. That's up from 56% in April of 2018. 85% of Americans are concerned over gun violence. That's what the poll shows. Yet we don't see the action that they're calling for in Congress.
Well, I think the Americans' views on guns are complicated. Yeah. There's a lot of support for the Second Amendment. Americans are generally reticent to limit their fellow citizens' ability to do things, whatever that may be, even if it's something that's not so terrific. They're not inclined to make laws prohibiting it. So it doesn't surprise me that while there's some support for modest gun control measures, that hasn't translated into congressional action. The same thing's happened on abortion, where a lot of Americans would support some modest restrictions, but Congress isn't about to do those either.
All right, Leonard Zeskind, you were telling us a moment ago that the gunman in this instance acted because he was motivated by groups, by a movement. And certainly a lot of this information people obtain on the internet. The internet right now is a repository of hate speech, racism, incitement. How do you counter that? How do you regulate what is on the internet without compromising key provisions of the American Constitution, which allows for free speech?
Well, I don't know how to regulate the internet, quite frankly. I think the solution is more speech by people who oppose the white nationalists, more people who are willing to stand up and say, this is not an emotion-filled movement. This is an ideological movement with intellectual leaders who have seeped into our very mainstream right now, and we've got to kick them out. And we need people from every walk of life, Republican, Democrat, Independent, I don't care. And I want them to stand up and say, this is wrong and we don't want it. And if they say that in a neighborhood where the white nationalist movements live, then maybe we'll get somewhere in life. But until the American people stand up, we're going to be suffering through more violence. Let me add that the immigration crisis is leading to a situation where white people will become a minority in a nation of minorities. And the Census Bureau talks about that happening sometime in the 2040s. And I think we're going to see an escalation of violence until we get the immigration and demographic balance settled. And until we do that, we're in trouble.
So you're saying, Leonard, that a lot of this violence is, or part of it, is being driven by what? White anxiety over the change in demographics in the United States?
That's what the man said in his manifesto. That's what other shooters have said. Look back at what's been going on. That's what the movement talks about. They call it white dispossession. They're not being dispossessed, but they are have to learn how to share. And these white people don't want to share. They want a white place only, a white nation. That's why they're called white nationalists. And they want to create a white space because they know they're in the process of losing control of the population because they're going to be a minority in a nation of minorities. And they are very aware of it. They talk about it constantly, and it's in the propaganda that you'll see.
Yeah, I think it's important that we note that these white supremacists are conducting terrorist acts in the United States. And it's not just enough for people to stand up and say they're opposed to it, although that's important. There needs to be a law enforcement solution as well. And the president talked about using...
Well, I agree with that.
Yeah, and he talked about using federal resources to go after some of these groups and monitoring these internet sites where a lot of these things are discussed. And that has to be a critical component of it. This is not a new phenomenon in the United States. There have been white supremacists in the past. There have been other terrorist groups in the past. It's not like we just invented violent political action here in this country. We have a long history of a bunch of crazy people doing crazy things. They're very small groups. It's entirely appropriate for the federal government to go after them and find them and arrest them and bring them to justice.
What are your thoughts on this, Greg? You do a lot of work in this. You are a security specialist. Should this be treated as a law and order issue? It's an issue of mass murder here.
Well, that's definitely one of the factors that needs to be considered. I agree with your commentary, or your guest commentary, that the reason this is being brought to the surface is because those white supremacists do feel like they're going to be displaced. I think that's exactly why you have this, what we call an uprising. But the FBI, all 12,000 agents, are committed to putting an end to this as soon as they can. That being said, you know, Director Wray was on Capitol Hill just last week and said there are about 4,000 active counterterrorism investigations going on at this time, of which about 1,250 are domestic terrorism investigations. He also stated that 100 domestic terrorists have been arrested so far this calendar year, which is a big uptick than in previous years. But I can assure you that this is a priority for the FBI, but the FBI is undermanned and understaffed. You got to think about the size of the FBI, 12,000 agents nationwide. To put that in perspective, the New York City Police Department has 39,000 officers. So we're very short-handed. We don't have the capacity, the manpower, or the ability to monitor all the social media platforms that need to be monitored to look for things like this manifesto. The FBI needs to develop better relationships with those social media companies and get a closer relationship with them so they can assist us in monitoring those sites.
John Donohue, what are your thoughts on how this issue can be resolved? There are many proposals around. Of course, we hear proposals all the time. One of the proposals that we've heard before in response to mass shootings is to implement universal background checks. We've heard for a ban on semi-automatic rifles, on the kind of assault rifles that some of these gunmen have been using. But you've written that these measures, these kinds of measures, will not be enough by themselves.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a complicated problem, and it does need a many-faceted solution. I agree that the FBI is understaffed, but there are gun measures that should be put into place, and quite frankly, the president should be much more measured in his discussions about immigration issues. You know, if I look back to when my grandparents came from both Italy and Ireland, they confronted the same language. They were, of course, both white, but they were talked of in very degrading terms as Irish and Italian immigrants to this country. So there is a history of fearing the immigrant community, and now no one fears, you know, Irish people in the you know, mainstream of America since they've been here long enough to fit in. But the same thing will happen with the current round of immigrants. They will bring credit to this country, and the president should be much more measured in his comments so that he does not stoke up the types of violence that we see around the world. When politicians realize that they can make political capital from engendering hate towards certain groups, they will often do that, and the country suffers because of it. So I think you need both comprehensive measures looking at the gun side, you know, additional police mechanisms to deal with the troubled individuals, but also measures from the president and the Republican Party to stop the overheated rhetoric about immigration. You know, the immigrants in this country bring great credit to this nation and have a much lower crime rate than the domestic population. So I think much more responsible language from the president on this issue would be helpful.
And the immigrants are going to pay my Social Security, and everybody that we're talking to today. Let's get real. They're a plus to the economy. They're brought here because capital has destroyed their home, and they need jobs, and they need, so what? My grandparents, your grandparents, we all needed to get work, and that's why white people are here.
Okay.
And
Lester, I'm wondering to what extent politics gets in the way of any kind of meaningful reform. As John Donohue just told us, the president should temper his language on immigrants, but we hear from a lot of analysts, a lot of commentators who tell us that the president has recognized that immigration is the issue that's going to get him reelected. So,
well, I humbly submit that he's completely wrong. We just had an election last year. The president made immigration the ending issue for the Republican campaign. He talked about caravans coming up from Central America and, oh, they were going to invade the United States and it was terrible and there's a crisis on the border. And then Republicans got creamed in the election. So our most recent evidence is that the immigration issue is not a winner for Republicans. I think the president won in 2016. He did talk about immigration, that's fair to point out, but he was running against a completely different opponent then who carried a lot of baggage. That's not going to happen in 2020. This is not a winning issue for him. It'd be terrific if he could use the tragedy that happened this weekend to pivot to a more positive message for the country.
all right, before this gets into a debate about immigration, I want to get back to gun control and get back to Greg. Greg, gun control critics often say guns don't shoot people, people shoot people, at least those who don't want any kind of gun control legislation. But we have evidence that show that gun deaths have dropped significantly in those countries that have adopted tough gun control laws. Australia for one, Japan for another. So why is it so difficult to adopt a similar position here in the United States?
Simple, because of the Second Amendment. Second Amendment shall not be infringed. It gives the right of every American citizen the right to bear arms. Australia doesn't have that. Great Britain doesn't have that. It's comparing apples and oranges. You will never get rid of the weapons in America. It's part of the Constitution unless you amend the Constitution.
Would you support an amendment of that kind, hypothetically?
I would not personally. No, I would personally not do that. The Second Amendment was put in place to defeat tyranny. That was the purpose behind it. So you can always say that there's always a chance for the government to become tyrannical, and the citizens need the right to defend themselves.
Okay. Leonard Zeskind, is there a way of adopting meaningful change in the country as far as guns are concerned, and at the same time keeping the Second Amendment and keeping it in the form that it has right now?
I think hunters use a different kind of gun to shoot deer and turkey and to use fishermen than these fully automatic weapons that are used in these shooting acts. And the weapons that are made only to shoot people do not fall in the Second Amendment. And the Second Amendment,
well, these were not fully automatic weapons.
Doesn't allow you to have tanks. You're allowed to have a gun in the house, but you're not allowed to get crazy with owning guns. And the gun discussion is not skewed in this country because of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, for many decades prior to the most recent history, was Second Amendment was written to support militias. That's what the origin of the Second Amendment was. And let's get real. The Second Amendment it isn't what causes guns. It's the National Republican, the NRA, the National Rifle Association. It's Gun Owners of America. It's gun lobbies attached to the gun manufacturers that want free access to every kind of nutcase gun in the world.
Actually, Leonard, there are a substantial number of members of the NRA who are in support of gun control legislation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's the NRA leadership that's the problem. I've been to NRA conventions, and I've seen the just general Americans there that are there for the educational component, the training, the good times they have with fellows. But the NRA leadership is a Republican machine, and they get votes, and they get votes in Congress, and they stop good legislation. And there shouldn't be any question about that. They themselves say they do that. So please.
John Donohue.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I just would agree that the NRA leadership has acted appallingly across the board, from their embrace of Putin and their efforts to stop meaningful gun reform, even when meaningful gun reform is about to be passed, they always tried to gut its effectiveness. Remember, Bill Clinton was successful in presiding over the greatest drop in crime in American history from 1993 to 2000. One of his efforts to get the assault weapon ban passed, as well as the Brady background check bill, but the NRA was able to diminish the effectiveness of both of those measures. So, for example, the Brady bill says you can't buy a gun at Target or Walmart without going through a background check, but you can buy one from a private sale or gun show. This is a ridiculous loophole that allows the criminals to get access to guns. This was the NRA's misconduct that led to this. Overwhelmingly, NRA members support universal background checks, but that would cut into gun sales, so the NRA is unwilling to engage in that.
And if you've ever been to a gun show...
Very quickly, gentlemen, because I have to go. Leonard, you first, and then Greg. Very quickly, please.
Well, if you've ever been to a gun show, they've got trash cans full of 5,000 bullets.
Okay.
You know, it's a gun and machine gun emporium. And
okay. Greg, very quickly, I've got a few seconds.
Fully automatic weapons have been illegal in the United States of America since 1996. There are no fully automatic machine guns out there doing active shooters.
Right.
The weapons used this past weekend was not an automatic weapon, it was a semi-automatic weapon, which means every time you pull the trigger, a round comes out.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there. That's all we have time for. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Very nice. If we had another...